So welcome everyone to Narkis Bible Study. For this beginning of December, we have been looking at Isaiah. And last week we looked at the historical background and the first few chapters of Isaiah, chapters 1 and 2, and I think also a little bit of chapter 6. And today we're going to continue through and look at chapters 3 to 5, roughly. We can recap anything from 6 as well. And I'll just start us with a brief prayer. Lord, thank you for bringing us all here virtually from all parts of the world. Thank you for your word spoken through Isaiah, Yeshayahu ben Amoz, way back when. Thank you that your word is so powerful and its validity remains. And help us understand more of it tonight or whenever people are viewing this, that we could understand the background and that it could make it even more alive for us. In Jesus' name, amen. So Gary laid out who Isaiah was and what was the historical context he was prophesying in. And I see, in order to extrapolate and find out how is Isaiah speaking into our life, we need to understand how Isaiah spoke into their lives, the people there around him, and what was he like? What was the context like? When he said these things, what did it mean for them? And then we'll be able to see the parallels. And the more I read, the more I realize not much changes in the world. We still need to hear these things again and again. Isaiah was active during several reigns of kings, and I think that Gary mostly looked at Uzziyahu, who's also called Azariyahu. And by the way, I think I've done a Bible study on this, but it's really fascinating if you look in Chronicles and compare to Kings of this king. Because in one of them, he's called Uzziyahu, and in the other, Azariyahu. That's not the interesting part. The interesting part is that when you read it, the one that calls it Azariyahu has all these poetic or verbal links to strength and might, which is the meaning of his other name, Uzziyahu, Oz, the might of the Lord, right? And so even though he's using Azariyahu, he's hinting at the other name, and vice versa. When the author is using Azariyahu, which is the Lord helped, that's when he hints at Uzziyahu. When he's using Uzziyahu, he hints at the Lord helping him all the time. Help, help, help. And there's all these words there. I think some would even be, if you just read it in English, I think you'll see some of those if you're sensitive to it. Other things maybe would only be found in Hebrew, but it's fascinating. So while both authors choose one of his names, they are both aware of the other one because they're hinting at it in their word choice. But that's not the topic of tonight. He was a great king and obviously made a big impression. And then I think you also got to Ahaz. Uzziyahu was mostly good. He just got carried away. And he was punished with the leprosy at the end of his life. But in terms of his life work, he would be classified, I think, as a good king. Whereas Ahaz is mostly bad. He tries to basically set up a reform to take people away from worshiping God and worshiping God in the way that God asked for. Again, there's two issues there when you're reading biblical texts. Obviously, worshiping another God is wrong. Foreign idols, idol worship, and these idols representing these other gods. So that's one way to mess up in your worship. But the other way is to try to worship the one God. You're still trying to worship Yud He Vav He, but you're doing it the wrong way because you're doing it in a way that God specifically said not to do, probably because it was too similar to pagan practices or something of that nature. So those are two ways people can mess up. And for Ahaz, he was blatantly trying to get people to worship other gods because he basically thought, he looked around and he said, you know, we're this little kingdom. There's all these other kings, and every other country, you know, their mindset is each country has its own god. Sorry, you had a question?
I don't know if other people have problems.
You can't hear?
Now I can, but you talk about Ahaz. First of all, it was idol worship, who were other gods in effect, and then worshiping Yahweh in the wrong way, and then I lost it.
I was saying that he was blatantly trying to get people to worship other gods and worship in the wrong way. He made changes in the temple, and he was setting up other shrines outside of the temple, which is against what Deuteronomy says, that there's one God and you need to come to one temple to worship him. And it seems like he was impressed with these other kingdoms. And the logic is, if these other kingdoms are so strong, and we're not so strong as the kingdom of Judah, we're this little thing compared to Aram and Syria and Assyria compared to Ashur. We're like this little kingdom. And so since they're so big, their gods must be better than our gods. That's kind of the logic. And so why not ask them for help, those gods, because they've been able to help their people successfully. And so it's a very dangerous place that Ahaz had people in. Specifically, though, when I'm looking at the chapters we're about to read, I think we'll read through a little bit of them, you get the feeling that things are good financially in the kingdom of Judah because people have pride. And if people have pride, it means that they're feeling accomplished, they're feeling secure, and they're feeling that they have got what they need. They're not desperate.
When you see in the current situation the Republic of North Korea, they also express pride, except the people who are oppressed, but the official channels are very proud.
Yeah.
So it's not a one-on-one conclusion that when you are proud that you're rich, I think.
Sure. No, it means some people in your society are. And in fact, we see that some of the injustices that Isaiah keeps speaking out against, it is that the people who are rich off the backs of the poor, and they're oppressing them. And it's a very big deal. He comes back to this a lot. So maybe what I will do, I wanted to just read a little bit in Isaiah chapter 3, and you guys are welcome to read along in whatever translations you have. We have some interesting little verses. We may want to ask what some of your translations are. Okay, so I'm going to start in Isaiah 3. I'm going to read from the Net Bible, but then we'll reference the Hebrew as we go along. Look, the sovereign Lord of heaven's armies is about to remove from Jerusalem and Judah every source of security, including all the food and water, the mighty men and warriors, judges and prophets, omen readers and leaders, captains of groups of 50, the respected citizens, advisors and those skilled in magical arts, or you could say also artisans. Instead of magical arts, just artisans. Depends how you want to
crafty magician and cunning charmer.
And those who know incantations. Yeah, it's in a list with advisors. Yoetz is an advisor. It literally says Chacham Harashim. wise of, and then depending how you translate cheresh, is it charashim, people who work with like artisans of metal, or is it artisans of magic? It could be either. But then with Nivon Lahash, the parallel makes it seem like it is magical arts. Nivon is like an enlightened, bright person of charming. Lahash, divination kind of stuff. So this sense of security people have, they're leaning. Mash'en u mash'ena says they're able to lean on something, and that something is going to be taken away from them. And so we have this list of everything people might be leaning on. So if you have your food and water sources, that's important for any city. Your mighty men and warriors for protection, your judges and prophets for feeling secure, judges deciding what's happening in your society, and prophets also guiding people. And then, you know, a whole list of things, including respected citizen there. That's Nisul Fanim, which is interesting because it's using a metaphor there to describe this respected citizen that involves being lifted up, which is one of the themes you see in Isaiah, where all the lifted up are going to fall and the lowly are going to be lifted up. There's this reversal theme going on. So Nisul Fanim is literally lifted up of face. It's like if you have an established
What
rank.
verse are you on, Sharon?
That was in verse 3.
Right, lifted up.
After captains of groups of 50,
Right.
it mentions these respected citizens, these lifted of face. It's just a little thing. It doesn't change the meaning. I'm just pointing out the texture, because there's always these themes going on that you won't see if you just read respected citizens.
Is it just a reflection of Psalm 28? Some have chariots, some have horses, but we will remember the name of Adonai our God. I mean, really, it's saying we're trusting in all these things, and you're going to have, and Isaiah is saying you're going to have them taken away.
Right, because they aren't recognizing the name of God. That's the problem here.
Right.
And so it's like the mash'en and mash'ena, two forms of this word for support. If you're leaning on something, and it's not the right thing to lean on, you know, God's going to come and whack that off, and then you would fall, basically. That's the picture it creates in your mind. And then in verse 4, and I will make their young people rulers, or I will make their youths officials. I have malice young men. I don't know why malice young men, but it's a strange word there. Ta'alul.
I've got capricious.
Capricious young men will rule over them.
In my translation, it's even I will give children to be their prince and babes to over them.
Yes. So it could be any of the above, really. It's a rare form. It's a strange word, and it's how you interpret it. Olal, a word from the same root, means an infant or a young kid. Olal, you know the famous verse in Psalm 8, where mipi olalim veyonki mi sadetaos. From the lips of infants and babies, you have established strength. So that root is connected to young children, babies. Coincidentally, the word we use today for baby is not found in the Bible, tinok. Instead, in the Bible, we have yonek or olal. And yonek today is used for a mammal or something that sucks, a sucker. It's literally yonek, one who sucks.
Could you say that it's a kind of exaggeration?
In verse 4 here?
Yeah.
Yes.
Strong expression, not literally,
it
but
could be an exaggeration. I think most prophets use exaggerated language because they're trying to make a point. So when they say kids are going to rule over you, they don't mean literally 5-year-olds are going to become king. I mean, maybe, but I think they're talking about more people who don't know what they're doing. Young people who really don't have wisdom are going to rule over you. It's not considered here a good thing. So the other way you could take this word is that capriciousness, ta'alul, and lihit olel. There are other ways you could understand this word, and it's interesting because further on in this chapter, you have this same metaphor of people who shouldn't be in charge that are going to be in charge, and kind of like a fulfillment of these verses. And it uses not exactly the same word, but a related word from this root. So we'll get back to the same discussion. But there's going to be this situation that's bad news because the people in charge shouldn't be there. Okay, so I will make youths their officials, malicious young men will rule over them. The people will treat each other harshly, men will oppose each other, neighbors will fight. Youths will proudly defy the elderly, and riffraff will challenge those who were once respected. Indeed, a man will grab his brother right in his father's house and say, "You own a coat, you be our leader. This heap of ruins will be under your control." At that time, the brother will shout, "I'm no doctor. I've no food or coat in my house. Don't make me a leader of the people." So the word for doctor there is hovesh, someone who wraps, presumably, a wound. And so maybe the sense is, you know, I don't have a solution here for this kind of sickness in our society or in our family or in whatever it is.
Isn't chovesh the same word that's used for people who are in the army who go and wrap wounds? Somebody who is chovesh?
I think so.
It's
I'm
like
not up with all my army jargon because I never did the army.
chovesh is like a first aid worker in the army.
Yeah, yeah.
So there are two items in these verses which are important to become a ruler. The one is you must be rich, you must have possessions, and the second is you must be able to solve the problems, to heal the ills.
Yeah.
That are the arguments uh, why the man says, "I'm not the right person for that," but it also gives something about the criteria of
Right.
where people were looking for, maybe because of the problems they had.
Right.
Is that a quite is it the right conclusion?
Yeah, I think so. Yes. So then in verse 8, Jerusalem certainly stumbles, Judah falls, for their words and their actions offend the Lord. And remember, every time you're talking about Jerusalem and Judah, because they're grammatically feminine words, a city in Hebrew is feminine, the easiest metaphor is a woman. So Jerusalem and Judah are always personified, and it's going to be a woman or a young woman. And we're going to see women imagery a lot tonight or this morning, whenever you're watching. Okay, so, but the reason Jerusalem and Judah are stumbling and falling is that their words and their actions offend the Lord, or they rebel against his royal authority. They rebel against, it even says kvodo, his respect or his glory.
I've got defying the eyes of his glory. It's interesting because it ties up with what Gary was saying last week about, I mean, and you're putting this in the context of Ahaz, I think, but it's when Uzziah dies that that Isaiah sees the Lord lifted up in his glory.
Yeah.
He's not defying the glory, he's seeing it and worshipping and whatever.
And when you're setting something else up to be glorious, then you're not recognizing God's glory.
Right.
It's like a mutually exclusive thing.
Right.
So by not recognizing God's glory, you are rebelling against it.
Right.
You're defying it.
My translation says to provoke the eyes of his glory, which is in the line of your explanation.
Yes, that's right. The look on their faces testifies to their guilt. Like the people of Sodom, they openly boast of their sin. Okay. Now, Sodom is often used as like the paramount sinner, because you can look at so many facets of their sin. One of the huge ways they were sinners was their pride. Like here, they openly, not only did they sin, but they're fine with it. They're happy about it. And they're even proud of themselves. And their pride is a big problem.
Is the indication that what is said here, declare their sin as Sodom, that it refers to the mentality of the people in Sodom who didn't recognize their sins either?
Yeah. Well, I think it says their sins are like Sodom. They said them and they didn't hide them.
It's like gay pride marches down Jerusalem's highway. Oh, sorry.
Yeah.
Sodom is also mentioned in chapter 1.
Yeah.
Basically equating Jerusalem with Sodom and
exactly.
And Gomorrah.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Verse 10.
And again, while Sodom is known for its sexual promiscuity, their major problem is their prideful heart that leads them to think they can do what they want. There are no morals, they decide, and they have no respect for God, so they can treat other people like foreigners who come to their city. They can just completely abuse, and that's okay. It's just kind of like this blatant, prideful, we can do whatever we want.
But I also saw, I think in Ezekiel, another reason, and that is what we just mentioned before here, to oppress people financially, to not taking care of people who are in financial need, in social need, just disregarding your social duties in your society.
Yeah.
Which is the same subject what Jesus enters when he is when he says, well, blessed is he who does this and that. It's the same item.
Yeah.
So
and
I don't know if Isaiah really thought of the sexual aspects as we here have all the emphasis on the social aspects.
Yeah, it's much, much more, because the core, the root of their sin is their pride and their selfishness, and then that works itself out in all the rest.
Right.
And here in verse 9, we have kind of a summary of what this chapter is saying, because again, they're comparing Jerusalem and Judah to Sodom here, and they're saying, Oy lenafsham, woe to themselves, because they're gonna get paid back with bad. Now, how does it say here? For they bring disaster on themselves. But that word bring disaster, it's gamlu. It's not just that they're getting disaster out of nowhere, they're reaping the disaster that is the result of what they've been doing. Like it's a consequence. They're going to get the consequence of what they've been doing, and it's bad. So then we have this phrase is going to be repeated several times. Verse 10, tell the innocent, or in Hebrew that's tzaddik, which can also be translated righteous. Tell the innocent it will go well with him, for they will be rewarded for what they have done. So again, they're going to eat the fruit of their actions. That's the metaphor here. And then in verse 11, the same thing for the wicked. Woe to the wicked sinners, for they will get exactly what they deserve. And here it actually says, Oi, that's the woe, comma, le rasha ra. So, oi, for the wicked person, it's going to be bad. Because they're going to...
It's the same picture, isn't it?
Yeah,
You're
it's
going
the
to eat
same,
the
it's the
fruit of your
opposite side of the
actions.
coin. The people who are innocent of evil are going to enjoy the fruit of what they've been doing, and the people who've been doing evil are going to
get their own fruit.
Eat the fruit. Here it doesn't say eat the fruit. It says the
I know, but the message is the same.
Yeah, the message is the same.
And
They're
it's
going to get back what their hands have done.
All the way through now, we're going to start getting the fruit of the vineyard in chapter 5, which is
Yes,
and so on.
yes, exactly.
Right.
And what is that fruit? What have people been doing is a question. What is Isaiah so upset about? Verse 12 is a little tough. Ami nogsav me'olel. The Hebrew there, it's interesting because many people just amend it here. But you could actually understand what's written, that my people, his oppressors, are children or treat cruelly. It depends on if you read that word as a noun or a verb. Again, we're back to the same root, ayin lamed lamed, that we talked about up in verse 4. But because we do have verse 4, I'm kind of going towards the interpretation of this being another strange word for a young child.
Yeah, I've got children are their oppressors and women rule over them.
Yes. So the Narkis Bible, oppressors treat my people cruelly, creditors rule over them. And that is backed up by the Septuagint, where if you read, instead of nashim, you'd have to read noshim. Noshe is a creditor. So they're possible, emendations are possible. But again, you can also read it that a young kid and a woman were seen in Isaiah's day to be not competent rulers. And so therefore, that would kind of be the mirror of what we saw in verse 4, where God says, I'm going to let these people rule over you because of what you've been doing.
Translation in the Good News Bible, and that is, moneylenders oppress my people and their creditors cheat them, which is a total different view of the text.
Well, it's not totally different, but it is different. Again, they're taking me'olel to be not a noun, but a verb. They are, there are verbs from this root that mean to act severely, sometimes a little bit of mistreating, let's say, mistreating them or treating cruelly.
And the word moneylenders, is that interpretation, or is there some Hebrew meaning in the text?
Again, you know, this prophecy is like poetry, and they don't have all the connecting words. You have to put the connections together. The word order is different as well, so it's open to interpretation. You could see these both. You could see both interpretations working in the Hebrew text in front of us.
Great, thank you.
But for those of us without the Hebrew, I mean, I've got your guides mislead you and destroy the way of your paths. So
okay,
these
that's
people,
the next part. That's the next one we haven't got.
they're linked.
You're right.
That's the 12. So what you've got is you've got children, women, whatever. I mean, basically, not people who are seen to be leaders of stature, because we're talking about the fact that righteousness has going not there. And the whole message always is, do justice, be faithful, take care of the underdog, and so on and so on. It gets repeated time and again in Isaiah.
Yeah.
So these you're just, just doing it, whatever.
And either way could be a reversal. if, for instance, if you haven't been being fair, now you're going to be treated unfairly.
Right.
You're going to have oppressors that come and treat you cruelly, and your creditors are going to come take you over. So that's a possible reading. Or because you haven't been doing things fair, basically they're presenting a picture of a upside down society. And kind of in the day of Isaiah, it's considered embarrassing that a woman or a young child would be a leader. That to them was like, how could that happen? So that would be seen as this
sorry.
reversal, similar to verse 4.
When you see there's a consequence of their actions, then the translation of moneylenders and creditors is logical.
Sure. But if you look back at verse 4, the other one's also logical, because I will give ne'arim, I will give young people to be your officials, and ta'alulim will be in charge of you, will rule over you. So if this is kind of like fleshing out what was already said in verse 4, then the whole youth and women would make sense as well. Right. So it's very hard to know what the original one was, because both of them do in fact make sense in the context. But the idea, I think what Gemma was saying, is that the people who are supposed to be guiding are actually misleading. And they have confused people's path. They haven't made it straight. They haven't helped them out. And I think this reminds me also in Jesus' day, you know, when he talks about the teachers making it more difficult for those trying to enter the kingdom of heaven. And they've burdened them with things that they can't do. Basically, they've confused them. They've taught them that they need to be doing stuff that maybe they don't need to be doing, or in ways they don't need to be doing it. So God's going to get up and come, says in verse 13, the Lord takes his position to judge. He stands up to pass sentence on his people. The Lord comes to pronounce judgment on the leaders of his people and their officials. He says, it is you who have ruined the vineyard. And here, I don't know what this is referencing. I don't think he's given his vineyard poem yet, but you never know. Some of these prophecies may be written down in a different order than they were actually delivered. But I think in general, he's talking about vineyards in general, not necessarily Israel being the vineyard yet. Because in the next half of the verse, he says, you have stashed in your houses what you have stolen from the poor. So that's clearly a reference to abusing the poor.
My translation says grinding the faces of the poor.
Okay, so that's in verse 15, correct?
Yeah.
So the ruining the vineyard, it actually doesn't say ruin there. It says you have purged, you could say, or burned out. This word is something either goats do, where they just eat up all the grass, or fire does and just eats everything up. Devoured?
Devoured the vineyard.
Yes.
And so the vineyard. You've eaten it up.
What it reminds me of is when you go to collect your grapes in the vineyard, you're supposed to leave some for those poor people out there. And in this context, it seems to me that that's what he's hinting at, that, you know, instead of doing the appropriate thing where you take all your grapes, but you leave the rest, you leave the remnants for poor people, you like completely take it all. And
well, that's what it says in the rest of the other half. You've devoured the vineyard. The plunder of the poor is in your house. In fact, you've just not left the gleanings.
Yeah.
You've taken the lot. You've left nothing for anybody else.
Right.
So the plunder of the poor is, in fact, that part which would be appropriate for the poor people after you have left them with your taking the things that belong to you, not the edges of the
right, exactly.
Belong to the owner. They belong to the poor.
Exactly, they're for the poor. They've clearly been ignoring this. Malachem, what's up with you oppressing my people? And the face of the poor you're grinding. These are very strong images. What does it mean to grind the face of the poor? I mean, if you think about grinding your grain every day, that, you know, you have a stone on top of a stone and you grind that down, and that's how you get your flour. And when you have this word picture where you have someone's face on that stone and you're grinding it, you know, that's gruesome. It's very powerful. And it's obviously, it's a metaphor for how they're treating poor people. And they're being abused and not helped. They're being overlooked. And, you know, such
Something
laws
like
that were made to protect them are being ignored.
in English, would you say something like you wiping their face in it?
You could.
It's not the same metaphor.
Mm-hmm.
It's the same type of idiom.
As long as idiom still represents not just that you're shaming them, but that you're crushing them, their very sustenance.
Right.
You know, you're
abusing them.
You're abusing them. You're taking from them. It's a very practical thing. You're not just making fun of them. You're causing them to be poorer. You're harming them.
The Good News Bible translation says, and take advantage of the poor.
Yeah.
Which is in the line what you said.
Exactly, because the poor, especially in ancient society, but also today's, they're the ones that are vulnerable. They're the ones that need protection. And that's why you need special laws, like when you go into your vineyard, leave a little bit for poor people. And so if you're going to ignore that law, it means that those poor people are unprotected now. And so you're hitting them right where they're vulnerable. And they can die. They can starve, you know, they can have nothing, or they can sell themselves into slavery because of what you're doing. So that's very much what he's after. And then he starts this new, okay, so he seals that the sovereign Lord of heaven's armies has spoken. So that's kind of like his first general prophecy to everybody. And now he's going to turn to the daughters of Zion. And I would say this is interesting because it's both real. He could be talking to the noble daughters of Zion, so the young women who are growing up in their affluent houses. And at the same time, those women represent Zion because Zion's a woman. See what I'm saying? So you can go back and forth between the actual women who are, you know, everything he describes here, and then Zion, who they represent. So they are proud. That's the first thing. They are high up, it says. Gavhu. They put themselves high up. They've stuck out their necks. Or here it says they walk with their heads high and flirt with their eyes. They skip along and the jewelry on their ankles jingles. So the Lord will afflict. It's interesting here. It says the foreheads. Code. Okay, it's another word. It's a parallel word for head. You could say brow maybe. And it's similar, if you think about it, it doesn't use the same words, but to have a scab on your forehead is similar to the leprosy that Uzziyahu got, in the same vein of being proud. He thought he could just do everything. Well, if I've done so well so far, I can just take over this thing too. And he is ignoring God's rules. And in his pride, he gets punished with leprosy. So it's similar how they get punished. And then the last part of this verse, I don't know why our translation says the Lord will make the front of their heads bald. The Hebrew is much more graphic.
I've got Adonai will expose their secret parts. That's pretty graphic.
It is very graphic. The word pot in temple imagery is a socket. It's the socket of a door. And even in modern Hebrew, this refers to female genitalia. And then ye'ara is to pour something out or to empty it out. And so Jewish commentators suggest that they would have some type of disease in that area that would cause, would cause uncleanliness. So in the same way, you think of leprosy and being unclean and being outcast. These are some of the same diseases.
Maybe like a venereal disease or something.
Yeah, exactly. So you think you're so great? Well, this is what's going to happen. And you have something on your head and something on your, you can't say bottom, but down. So top and bottom. And that also lines up with the Isaiah where he says, from the top of your head to your foot, there's nothing that is pure anymore.
And so that follows on with 18 and even 19, 20, 21. But
yeah.
All the fineries got to get stripped, your ankles, your headbands,
Yes.
your crescents, your pants. This is all the outward regalia of a woman, basically.
Yes. And to have your private parts revealed is pretty shaming as well.
Yeah.
The Good News has another kind of shaming translation. It said, I will shave their heads and leave them bald. Is there a connection to the text?
Well, that's understanding pot in a different way.
It's more interpretation.
For some people, there's some guy who based it on an Akkadian loanword that said this was the brow or forehead or something. I don't know. It doesn't seem to me to be very solid, and it's certainly outside of the traditional interpretation. But it's there. Ye'ara is normally to empty out or to bear something. This is connected to parts of the body that aren't supposed to be bared. I mean, this verb comes in those contexts. So I don't understand.
But throughout the Bible, there's many examples of men having their heads shaved, and that presumably is a shaming thing.
Sure, but this specifically says to make it naked or to empty it out. That's the kind of verb this is. It's not shaving. Shaving is a shame, but...
No, I was only following on from what Richard said.
When you shave your head, it's uncovered. There's no hair anymore there. That I could make a logic of it.
Yeah.
And that they made it in that way. It could.
If you viewed it as a follow-up of the first half of the verse, you could take it that way. But I don't see it that way from the words that they actually use. It doesn't seem to me the most probable reading. The other reading is a little more shocking, but I think Isaiah likes to be shocking. And when you continue this whole thing, he's describing shocking things. He's not trying to be whatever. But I want to skip down quickly to Isaiah 5 because we've got to read the vineyard. We're running out of time. So Isaiah sings a song. I'll read it. If you jump down to chapter 5, verse 1, I will sing to my love a song to my lover about his vineyard. My love had a vineyard on a fertile hill. Or in Hebrew it says, Bekeren ben Shaman. So keren could be like a ridge. It's also a horn. Ben Shaman is something full of fat. It's considered lush. He built a hedge around it, removed its stones, and planted a vine. He built a tower in the middle of it and constructed a winepress. He waited for it to produce edible grapes. Or in Hebrew just says he waited for it to make grapes. But it produced sour ones instead. Be'ushim, or either wild grapes or nasty grapes. So now, residents of Jerusalem, people of Judah, you decide between me and my vineyard. What more can I do for my vineyard beyond what I've already done? When I waited for it to produce edible grapes, why did it produce sour ones instead? Now I will inform you. what I'm about to do to my vineyard. I will remove its hedge and turn it into pasture. I will break its wall and allow animals to graze there. I will make it a wasteland. No one will prune its vines or hoe its ground, and thorns and briars will grow there. That's a shamir vashait. It's a nice little phrase, thorns and briars. I will order the clouds not to drop any rain on it. Indeed, Israel is a vineyard of the Lord of heaven's armies. The people of Judah are the cultivated place in which he took delight. So now in verse 7, they're interpreting this vineyard. And I want to look at these lines. He waited for justice, but look what he got.
Yeah.
What did he get?
Bloodshed.
Bloodshed. Anyone else? What do you have there?
End of verse 7 of chapter 5.
Yes.
I'm just telling the others.
Oppression.
What do you have for that word? He waited for justice, but look what he got.
Oppression.
Yeah, I've got oppression as well.
Oppression. Oh, interesting. Okay.
I have wickedness.
Wickedness.
The,
Nice.
the Greek has anomion.
Lawlessness. Yeah. Nice. They're all nice. He waited for fairness, but look what he got. Cries for help. What do you have there? Cries for help. What do you guys have?
Yeah, cry for help.
Cry for help.
Justice.
Yeah.
I've got for righteousness, but behold the cry. I just got a cry.
Okay.
Fight for justice.
Okay. So this is really beautiful in Hebrew. I'm going to read it to you, and it doesn't even matter if you can speak Hebrew. He says, Vaikav le mishpat. He hoped for, and it says mishpat. That's what he hoped for. That's a word you have translated as justice. It can also be righteousness, doing the right thing. Vehine mispah. And that's this word we don't know. Some people have bloodshed. Net Bible has disobedience. It only comes here. And we know it's something bad. And so there are different interpretations of what this word might be connected to and how to understand it exactly. But listen to the way Isaiah chose this word. If you hear mishpat, that's a word for justice, and then mispah, you can hear the similarity, right?
Yeah.
And so it's very poetic, because like instead of this, he got this. It's like the total opposite. So he had to find a word that sounded just like mishpat, but was like the opposite. So it's beautiful poetry. Vaikav le mishpat vehine mispah. Litzdaka vehine tse'aka. And again,
Same thing.
tzedakah is your word for fairness or another word for justice. And instead of that, you get tse'aka, which is a cry for help. Usually when someone's oppressing you, you cry out.
So it's injustice in disguise.
Exactly. It's the result of injustice. So he was hoping for tzedakah, but he got tse'aka. So it's very beautiful and very powerful wording. And that is Isaiah at his best.
And that's a nice tie-in with Sodom and Gomorrah as well, because in Genesis 18:20, when the Lord says he's going to bring judgment on those cities, he's walking with Abraham, and he says the cry against Sodom and Gomorrah is so great, and their sin has come up to heaven. So
yes, and the same for Nineveh, right?
Right.
The cry of oppression has reached God in heaven. It's gone up to heaven. It's so great. Yeah. So we don't have time to go into more of chapter 5, but it's it should speak to us, because many of us who live in what used to be called the West, and now I don't know what to call it anymore, because West is of course relative on the globe. So I'll just use West for now. We are rich. We are, what could you say? Self-sufficient. We have so much. And so these words are very important. It's not just for, oh, those people back there. If God could say to his chosen people that he loved, you guys got it all wrong. It doesn't matter who you are. It matters what you're doing. I don't care. You think you're exempt? You think you're privileged because you're the chosen people? No, you are not exempt. You must act justly. And if you don't, there are consequences, and they're going to get you. It's not like God has to send extra punishments. It's a consequence of the bad things they've been doing. And he gives a list of bad things they've been doing. They've been eating too much. They've been drinking too much. They have been taking other people's land and, snipping at the edges and getting more for themselves. They have great parties, and at the expense, of these other people who don't have anything. So I think what we can...
Sharon, is it linked too, though, with then and now, is that the trust. I mean, on the one hand, you've got this terrific pride, which says, we can eat what we like, we can drink what we like, we can party as much as we like, we're okay, Jack. Whereas the Lord is always saying, and even let's say as believers, oh, I'm saved and I've got a good congregation and I know this, this, and this, but it's always do it. It's not so much what you believe in your head, but go and do it. Yeah. Live out your faith, your faithfulness. And it's always about taking care of the widows and the orphans. I hate your feast days and whatever. I was thinking, and here, and it's always linked too with fruit. And I mean, you were talking before about where were we at the beginning of 3?
Yeah. And
the righteous will have good fruit, and the wicked will basically have lousy fruit, or will get things back. And here we've got Israel, the people of Israel. The vineyard is the house of Israel. And although I planted you and everything, you're producing lousy fruit. And what is rotten fruit? And what is the fruit that I want? It's not that you keep all the rules, but it's that you look for justice and you go for righteousness.
Or that you keep them in the right way. Because it looks like, if you look down verse 33, they pronounce the guilty innocent for a payoff. So they're willing to bend rules in order to benefit from it. And they're ignoring justice and the right thing to do. Yeah. And I think a lot of these themes come back, when Jesus brings good news. He brings good news to poor people, and he brings good news to humble people. And it's exactly in line with Isaiah, because he's saying like the proud are going to fall. And, the poor, both in spirit and in reality, are going to be exalted. God's going to make a way for them.
In the COVID discussion between the government and the people in Holland, there is a real discussion about how far can healthy people who are not vulnerable that much to COVID-19 celebrate life at the cost of the vulnerable people, and while spreading the virus. And it's still a covered discussion, but from the government there are hints from this is not just. And at the moment that they want to vaccinate, at the first they want to vaccinate the vulnerable people, just because it has to be deep frozen and in big lots. They must choose now first the nurses, but there will be another vaccine which is much better to be used a few weeks later. And from in the discussion between the government agency and the people who represent the government, the people, the chamber, there was a real item about how did you make those choices and couldn't you have done it different. It's all about ethics, and there is a real ethic discussion starting up now. How do you organize your vaccines?
Yeah.
And that's
Yeah.
exactly the same item as what we're talking about here.
Yeah. Because the spirit of it is we want to protect people who are vulnerable in our actions.
Yeah.
And as much as depends on us, we want to live in a way that honors everybody, including poor people and including people, you could say people with poor health. You know, they didn't ask for that. They're in that position. They are vulnerable and they need
At the
other people's protection.
yeah,
The strong have to protect them.
Yeah. Well, at
Yeah,
the other
absolutely.
time, they want the people who want to celebrate life. They ignore all those arguments and just go on. And we even had the situation of somebody in the hospital who didn't want to wear a face mask, and who at the end appeared even was tested positive and still was in the hospital to visit somebody and didn't want to wear a face mask. That mentality was illustrated today.
Yeah. Yeah. And however we act, we should always do our best, you know. Even if someone could argue a face mask isn't 100% protection, but if that's what you can do, you should also sit 2 meters from the person and not breathe down their throat, you know, all kinds of things. Whatever you can do that would be helpful, do it.
And in that sense, this what we read now is very connected to our actuality, to our own life.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Absolutely. So Gary, I guess we can end it there. And
I think, but just before you end, can we just look properly at 5:20? Because I think we're living in a situation of oi to those who call evil good and good evil. When present darkness as light and light as darkness, we present bitter as sweet and sweet as bitter. And I really think this comes back to really knowing what the truth is about whatever the situation is, rather than just jumping to what everybody says. I mean,
and then keep reading. That's also, beware those who think they are wise, those who think they possess understanding. Right. Yeah.
Right. So I think the whole, and the previous verse 16, but Adonai Sabaoth will be exalted through justice and the holy God consecrated through righteousness. And we have to think about what really Mishpat and Tzaddik, being Tzaddik, really is. I mean, I know our righteousness comes from the Lord, but
he asks us to live it out here.
It's an extraordinary chapter.
Yeah, it's very practical.
Yeah. And the only thing we didn't say is that the whole of this series is supposed to be looking towards sort of messianic expectations. And we've been so busy setting it within, if you like, almost a historical context and trying to bring it up to date. But somehow there's an echo of it coming all the time, because
yeah,
in a way, only when I can't go on, but you take it on. Do you see what I'm saying?
No, that true justice is established when the Messiah would be in place, because you have proper ruling, you have proper justice being enforced, you have care for the vulnerable.
Right.
And you have, it's good news for the poor. Yeah, absolutely.
So you have a situation which we're looking at scripture always within a current now context of then, whether it's Uzziah or Ahaz or Yotam, and we haven't got to poor old Hezekiah yet. It's also in the sort of what you would call the messianic fulfillment of Yeshua when he comes and he says, you know, Spirit of the Lord is upon me. And yes, I'm going to bring in justice and whatever. And also into the days we're living in now, when we're still waiting for the return. And we're not going to get into that, but at the same time, he is coming back and he will set up his kingdom. But in the meantime, we've got to be so careful that we don't get into this pride that I'm all right, Jack, and I've got it all worked out, and that we really understand what it means to call evil good. I was very struck recently. Every time God talks about, and it's true with Ahaz, that he offers his children to fire, which is to Molech, and it says somewhere, I forget where, and I didn't even think it could happen, or some such words. It's so shocking.
Yeah.
And we live in a days when abortions and all the rest of it are the regulation. Everybody can think it's okay, or if something's happened. And I mean, we don't really pick the two up and put the two together in our own time and begin to recognize and have God's hatred of evil.
Yeah.
Anyway, that's my.
Yeah, and Ahaz was specifically doing a sacrifice. I think most people who would be sacrificing a child would do so to secure future fertility, to secure goodness. Like if I'm willing to give up this, then this God will surely, benefit me somehow because of my great sacrifice. I gave this to them, and so they're going to give me back more, that kind of idea. And so if a king would give one of his kids, it would be like, wow, the God would surely then bless him. But very, very skewed concept.
I think there was also a sense, wasn't there, of somehow pacifying the God. I mean, I've never thought of it being a fertility. I mean, there were plenty of fertility rites and whatever to get better, to get more children. But I always thought that the whole thing about giving one's child to Molech was much more to do with pacifying this angry God who had this great fire burning in him.
In truth, I don't think we know enough about the workings, because I don't have a Moabite Bible. I don't know what they truly believed behind their rituals. But it's certainly that type of understanding. One of the two or some mix, whether there's pacifying a god or requesting. Usually there's something in it for the sacrificer. He receives some kind of benefit.
Mm-hmm.
So he receives security or fertility or power against enemies, something from it. And obviously it's completely against what God has asked and wants of people. And of course, it was appealing to another God. So in both ways, violating what Israel was called to be and show to the world.